So it was an interesting.
All right, we'll get started in just a moment. We got a couple minutes before we officially kick off. But if you like classes like these, let Jack know as they plan. I could probably do a couple more on Germany. When you're there for a week and you see a lot, it's hard to compress it in an hour. And then I was telling Bobby, Nancy, and Jan, we're going to southern Spain in October. So there's a lot to learn and see there and reflect on. So I can always do classes like that as well. I love to travel. I know many of you do too. I see a bunch of you who are always out and about. Tom Davis will be down here in a second, he said, and he's never here. He's always gone. But traveling to me always just opens up new ways of seeing the world, new cultures, new foods, deeper histories. You know, you go in the U.S. and we're like, oh, this is 300 years old, and we're really impressed. You go over there and it's like, this is 1,500 years old, or just the history, the roots of things. I love just having those opening experiences to get a wider view of the world. That's why I love to travel. I love to have kids travel. You'll see in the e-news this week I'm writing the article and about how this time, 7 years ago, I was in Scotland for the first time. This time last year, I was in Ireland for the sabbatical. And looking ahead to our heritage trip that's going to Scotland, Ireland in April. But then also we're taking the youth and college-age folk to Northern Ireland for a week in June to give them that experience. They're going to stay at Corrymeela Community, go through a program that they're going to focus on. How do you live well with difference? How do you become peacemakers in an increasingly divided world? So that's one of the best groups in the world that does that, so the youth will really have that special experience. You can read more about it in this week's e-news. So we'll start with why Berlin. A lot of reasons. Courtney and I were actually talking going to going to Italy instead, but it was actually Courtney's idea saying, you know, you're doing all this reconciliation stuff with Ireland and South Africa. You know, I think Berlin would be the next logical place as we're looking at how do we engage with history and hard history. How do we remember, engage with the past so that it shapes our future, but we also aren't held prisoner by the past successes or failures. And we struggle with that. We like to go to extremes all the time. Either everything's your past, it's exactly the way it has been, we haven't changed at all, or past doesn't matter anymore because we're new and different now. Both of those aren't real good approaches. We struggle with balance, being able to remember the past, honor it, learn from it, acknowledge especially the difficult parts of the past, while also being able to acknowledge we have come further, hopefully, or even in the midst of the difficult things, there were some good things to lift up as well. We so easily can focus on bad news, or we can so easily focus on good news. You have to have a bit of both to understand the world. We've said it before, it was, what's his name? John Fia, when he did a class, he had talked about a little bit how both, from a few years ago, the New York Times 1619 project and the Trump administration's 1776 project are both very flawed histories of the U.S. because they don't take into the fuller picture. They're looking through such a narrow view, both of them. One of the things we did in Germany was meet with this philosopher, Susan Neiman. Her book, Learning from the Germans, is kind of the basis of our trip in a lot of ways. And we did get a copy for the church library. We ate with her one evening, and she talked about how she'd write the book differently today, and she shared a lot of things I'll get into later that really helped to put words to what I've been thinking for a while, but also let me acknowledge, I guess, that the way I've been thinking wasn't completely off base because she's way smarter than me. And if she says it's okay to think like this, then great. More power to you. So we wanted to go to kind of learn how Germany has dealt with some pretty difficult pasts, but also some pretty brilliant, triumphant past stuff too. And also the idea that we need to work off our past, reckon with it, both as nations, as churches and as individuals, sometimes we have things in our past that we try to bury and hide. Usually that doesn't go well for anybody. It comes back up. If you can't in some way reckon with the pain that was done to you or the pain you caused, it comes back. How often do we see that the abused become abusers? Often because they don't reckon with that abuse they suffered or the abuse they participated in years ago. While doing that, it's important to remember that that difficult past can't define us entirely. No one is forever the perpetrator. No one is forever the victims. And that happens a lot in the U.S. and in Germany. Susan Neiman, who's American Jew but has lived in Germany for a long time, kind of talks about how sometimes, she's telling us this, that the Germans are so afraid to do anything because they consider themselves the forever perpetrators. We did bad. So we're never going to say anything about Israel or Jewish people. And sometimes Jewish people take up the mantle of forever victim. And that's not healthy either. There's a balance. They were victims. Sometimes they still are. But that's not all they are. And she spoke about how sometimes now you can't criticize Israel, the state, or you're considered anti-Semitic. And Germany's so afraid to say anything because of that past. There's a balance. And we may get more into that. There's so much to get into. But if you think about those things and how they apply to the U.S. and how we teach history. Yeah, we need to teach the difficult things of history. But we don't need to say this is all we are. While also recognizing, hey, here's some of the good points in history. You know, some places you can't say that Rosa Parks was black anymore in the curriculum. That's stupid. But also you can't say, we've only done horrible things as America, and everything's based on the things we've done bad. That's not right either. We've done some really remarkable things. We are never our worst days fully, and we're never fully our best days. I'd love if people only judge me by the best things I ever did. That'd be great. But that wouldn't be real, would it? And it's also not fair to judge me by my worst days either, because I'm more than that. Understanding history, culture, you have to tie all of that in. If you read my super long travel notes in Germany, I touched on a lot more of this. If you want to go back and read them, they're on the website. You can. So this is Germany. We stayed at Hotel Nina. This is Alexanderplatz. It would have been East Germany years ago. The Russians, Soviets built this tall TV tower to be like, look at us. We are advanced and we're awesome. Now it looks something from like the 70s, doesn't it? Because it was. This church here, Martin Luther King Jr. actually preached at. They're in East Germany. So that was interesting. So it's a big kind of hub. That's kind of one of the town hall things. But one of the things we kind of think most about Germany, of course, is the Brandenburg Gate. It was inspired by the Propylaea entrance to the Acropolis in Athens. Everybody loved all that Greek stuff. It's the height of democracy and civilization and all those things. So it was kind of a ceremonial entrance to Berlin. The capital of the Kingdom of Prussia at the time was erected by the Prussian Hohenzollern monarchy. It's made in 1791 as a peace gate. It is the only entrance left of those 18 that surrounded the city back then. It's the only one that's still left. It was restricted only for use by kind of royalty and these ceremonial things. Peasants had to kind of walk around the ends. So the statue on top of the gate is called the Quadriga. Depicts the goddess of victory driving a chariot pulled by 4 horses. But it's endured several changes since it was first installed in 1791. Remained in place there until Napoleon came through his grand army. He took the city without firing a shot. After occupying Berlin, he said, that's a cool statue, let's take it home. So they packed it up, took it home, but then when his empire started to crumble, the statue kind of got forgotten in a box somewhere until it was captured by Prussian soldiers following his defeat. So it was returned to Berlin and put atop the Brandenburg Gate again. But now, what was added was this cross and eagle. That wasn't there until after it returned from France. It was kind of there to be like, look, we're victors and we beat France. There's a big, Prussians love to kind of shove in the face of those they beat. So Frederick the Great, when he beat what he considered the three women who were ruling then, Austria, Russia, and France, he kind of had this big palace built a bit. Look how awesome I am. He had this kind of statue of like victory over these women rulers and stuff. They really like to shove in the face. There's a victory column in Berlin that has like round drum columns for each kind of victory they have, and they keep building on to it. Look, we're better than you, we beat you. So they put up that cross later. Then the cross was then removed during the communist era and was restored in 1990 during the reunification of Germany. So the current statue is kind of a recreation because the original one got torn apart by bombs during the siege of Berlin. So they made this nice reconstruction. But I find it interesting how sometimes our national symbols change in response to current events. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what we have to be careful is that our historical memory doesn't say that's how it always was. Because it wasn't. It's important to realize when did it change, why it changed, and then it's allowed to change again. We struggle with that in the church sometimes. We add something somewhere. It's like, we put this up. It must never be removed until Jesus returns. Realizing, well, I used to not have that. We like our tradition. So this got put on after Napoleon was defeated. What are some of the changes you've seen in national symbols over your lifetime, or the history of the U.S.? What has changed about some of our national symbols that we added or took away?
In God we trust.
That's one. That used to not be on U.S. money, and then it was. And now it's like it's always been there.
The pledge.
No. Why was In God We Trust put on the money?
The pledge and
The
support.
pledge,
God
Yeah.
on the pledge.
Yeah. Why was that added? Do you remember?
Red Scare.
Red Scare. In response to fear, we often add things, change things to help us feel better, to be less scared, to drive a certain rhetoric, narrative. So it's important to ask why we added that. It wasn't so much, well, we are a super pious nation. We are just so religious. We want everyone to remember God. That's not why it was added. It was to kind of drive, again, the wedge. We're different from them. Let's focus on the enemy and kind of differentiate ourselves. Another change, like in South Carolina, was the Confederate flag being added to the State House. It wasn't always on. It didn't get added until 1962. Now, what was happening in 1962? Civil rights movement. All these things. So they kind of used the 100-year anniversary of the Civil War as an excuse, but they kind of put it up, and that's when a lot of the Confederate memorials were erected during that time as kind of a slap in the face. You want to start getting rights? We're going to remind you exactly of your place. I listened to a really interesting podcast on the way home from South Carolina called Hunting and Fishing in the New South. It's based on this book, but it's really about a little bit about how enslaved persons were allowed to hunt and fish, but then really more so after emancipation, what happened, and how the South became a tourist destination for Northerners. We have to think Northerners are these abolitionists, non-racist. They came to droves in the South to experience the antebellum South, which meant they wanted to experience plantation life and black servants. So they would go to all these hunting and fishing lodges, all from the North, and they would write back. There's all these articles and editorials in these magazines that say, oh, it was great. It's how the way the world should always be. We had these black servants. They're really the best servants. They were designed to serve, and they're recreating what was before the war for not the Southerners, but for who? The Northerners, who had said this is all bad, but most didn't. For a long time, abolition was always a fringe movement. The North likes to pretend now that they were the abolitionists. They hated the abolitionists. They were the fringe people. So even in the early emancipation time, what used to be allowed for enslaved people, they weren't allowed to do anymore, so they would kind of change things a bit and say, we're now going to have these conservation laws that really were only focused on black people. They couldn't have guns or hunt or fish. They wanted them to remain in their place. And they created this whole industry. These symbols being added during the civil rights movement just kind of focused on that. And then later we think, well, we can't take these down. They've always been there. No, they haven't. And why? And each memorial is different. It's always important to think about why something exists. Why was it added? Why was it put on top? Why was this created? And then what was the original why? But also, what does it mean now? Because symbols can change. The Nazi symbol used to be a Christian symbol. We probably shouldn't have that up in our chancel anymore, right? Now I could say, well, historically, this was a Christian symbol, so we are just reclaiming it. Would that work? No. Some things change for mean something better. Sometimes change it means something worse. But you have to understand that. Now, I'll read something that Courtney wrote about the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin that I think is kind of hopeful and everything. It says, she wrote, Berlin has seen its share of strongmen, political and or military leaders who inspire a cult of personality based on the idea that the nation must be saved and they alone can save it, so you better get in line and give them full power to do whatever they want, which is never anything good. The Brandenburg Gate has watched them come and go. I couldn't ignore the history of the strongmen of Berlin, but I wanted to make sure not to glorify them, so I decided to focus on the gate. A gorgeous piece of neoclassical architecture built in 1788 to 1791, its original name meant Peace Gate. But dictators could not resist it. Look at it, what a great photo op. Napoleon passed through in 1806 and stole the statue called the Quadriga from the top. When the tables turned on him at last, the city got it back in 1814. Accompanied by brown shirts and SS members, Hitler passed through in his torchlight procession in 1933 after he became the chancellor. By the middle of 1945, Hitler was gone and Stalin was the new man in town. He wouldn't even last another decade, but the USSR's claim to East Germany meant that in 1961, the Berlin Wall went up to stop East Germans escaping from the west to the west. The Peace Gate was trapped between the lines of the Cold War, inaccessible to residents and visitors. But you know what happened to the wall in 1989. Like all walls, like all strongmen, it fell. I really don't understand strongmen. I like my mom's take on people who want to take over the world. You've got at most 100 years and you want to spend it making everybody else miserable? History teaches us that things don't end well for strongmen. Those who tortured the world over the last 2 centuries are gone, but the Peace Gate remains, open now to all who wish to pass through. I like that. She's smarter than me. It reminds us, history's full of atrocities. You can't forget them. But peace and love always end up winning out. They remain longer. Doesn't mean that the horrible things don't matter. They do. And they can change things for the worse. But it's helpful to remember that every one of those dictators has eventually fallen. And that gives us hope. All right, any questions about the Brandenburg Gate? What's interesting is they have a U.S. embassy like right here, but it's the fake embassy. It's not the real embassy. It's the show embassy. Because everybody had to have all the big countries had to have their special for show embassy around the Brandenburg Gate, because that's the fun area. All right, next up. Now here's another picture of Brandenburg, another angle. Boom, there you see it. It's cool. All right. This is called a Soperstein, or a stumbling stone. Has anyone ever seen these around Europe? Yeah, they're not just in Berlin. They're pretty much all over Europe. In Germany, there are now more than 90,000 such memorial blocks like this, laid in more than 1,200. There's more than 1,200 cities and towns across Europe and Russia where you'll find them. It's the largest decentralized memorial in the world. No one big organization said, let's do this. It was an idea of a dude, and more people caught on, And just it kept catching on, and people all over the world had these made. Each stumbling stone commemorates a victim outside their last known freely chosen residence or workplace. They're everywhere. It's a sobering symbol of what happened, what was lost. So you see, it's in German here, the last known residence of Dr. Julius Blumenthal, born 1900. This is the place he went to a concentration camp, Sachsenhausen, and then died in 1942. Two more, Treblinka, and so these are three different ones. Theresienstadt is in what's now Czech Republic. If you can call a concentration camp nice, that's the nice one. That's the one where the richer Jews, the more privileged Jews got to go. So there's a train depot outside Berlin that we went to that has a section of the track kind of memorialized, and each little section has a different date, how many people, and what camp they went to, from the very first train to the very last train. And you kind of see how the numbers are small, then they hit a highlight, the biggest, they start to go back down. At the very end, let's send a couple more, let's get a few more out. And they're trying to work towards the final solution. There was this meeting a little bit outside of Berlin of these heads of the SS and Gestapo who were meeting, and you can see the notes from that meeting because one guy took them because he thought he was going to kind of overtake his bosses, but then he lost the paperwork. They were found. You can see their plan of here's how many Jews are in each country, how many to kill, here's the total we need to kill by this date. We're not going to win the war, but how many can we exterminate? You can just see the notes there. The train station was outside Berlin because they didn't want people to really see what was happening. The people knew. But the Jewish Council of Berlin had to decide who was going to get on the trains, which is horrible and hard, but what choice did they have? If you leave it to the Germans, that could be even worse for you, right? But even in that, you can see the discrimination we'll talk about later in the sermon today some. They chose the radical Orthodox Jews to go first because they were less like the people on the council. Listen to people not like us and save us for last. How quick we turn and we categorize and we survive. But many from Berlin went to this camp, either this one or Sachsenhausen, but towards the end you start seeing more Treblinka, Auschwitz, more of the so-called death camps. So you see these everywhere. You're just walking and you stumble across one. That's why they're called stumbling stones. And it's that sober reminder, this was a person. Her name was Sarah. She lived here, Mary.
You had to pay to go to Theresienstadt.
Yeah.
You had to grease the wheels to get
Oh,
into
yeah.
that one.
Yeah, it's the wealthy and privileged. So if you had to go and you had the money, you wanted to go there for sure. But it's interesting as you walk around, you're just forced to remember. You have these big memorials, which are one thing, but they can sometimes be impersonal, especially the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. We'll show pictures of that. It's interesting, it's deep, but it's not that personal. This, Gustav and Sarah, they're married like us. They lived in this house, and they were taken away and sent to a camp, and there they died. And they're all over Europe. It forces you to remember these were human lives who lived like us. Everywhere you look, this used to be somebody's house and it was taken from them. So it got me thinking, what can we do in the U.S. here that's a decentralized environment that we need to remember? Who needs to be remembered? What needs to be remembered in just our everyday life that we can encounter and realize something happened here? We need to remember and honor them. Someone was once here and now isn't because of an injustice maybe we shouldn't let happen again. Can you think what would be something that would be helpful here? That would just be places.
Something that's not disseminated, but the power of names is the Vietnam Memorial.
Yeah, I think these names are always important. Unfortunately, for so many Holocaust victims, they didn't have all the names. But the Vietnam memorials are really powerful when you can go and you can take your paper and your charcoal and rub off the name. You think, what could we use that would be a decentralized memorial, just a place to remember what happened, lament and more. There's one they're trying to do, it's not working real well. Some of you have heard about, the Memorial for Justice and Peace in Birmingham, also called the Lynching Memorial. They had these big stone kind of hanging stelae that list county and all the names and examples of lynching that happened there. And they made one. And they made two. One for every county. So everyone that exists in that large memorial, they have one ready to give to every city and county. No one wants those. They don't want to remember. They don't want to be like, hey, our county had 56 lynchings, and here's the people's names that we gathered and had a picnic and watched be tortured and killed. So that makes us feel bad. But Germany has it. Everyone they know. We can't even put one little concrete thing up in a town somewhere that gives their names and says, this happened here. It's not all we are, but it's part of who we are. I also thought about, should we have something at the site of every mass shooting with names of victims? Las Vegas, Sandy Hook, Holt's nightclub, Buffalo Shopping Market, AME Church. I mean, I could go on and name things for the next 3 days sitting here. But to remember, they were kids. They were a mom and a dad, older church ladies, pastor's kid in Tennessee. It's easy to forget their names. It's easy to forget it happened. But you do that in this country. Every site, have a little plaque. Here's their names.
A sort of decentralized, lesser version of that is the memorials people erect to traffic accidents.
Yeah. Why do you think they do that?
To remember.
To remember, to say something happened here. Someone I loved died here. Don't forget. We'll put a plaque, we'll put a cross, because this place matters. It's not just some place you pass by and you see a piece of grass, you see some cows in a field. It's more important than that. Because my son, my husband, my friend, my dad, that's where they breathed their last. It means something. Next picture. This is the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. So one of the most profound places we visited was this kind of Holocaust memorial. It consists of massive stone blocks arranged around 19,000 square meter plot of land right between East and West Berlin, just past the Brandenburg Gate, so central location. There are 2,711 rectangular concrete slabs placed on a sloping stretch of land that have similar lengths and widths but various heights. You kind of walk in, and the ground's always kind of undulating. I think part of, no one really knows why the designer did everything he did. There's no names. There's no entrance or exit. You can come in and go out anywhere. You're walking, and sometimes you almost feel lost because now these stones are tight. It's like a maze. Where do you go? One minute you're going down, then you're going up, but you always have to go up to exit. A lot of people will hate it. A lot of people love it. It's like most art. I think it's powerful in the sense that in some ways it is so anonymous. It's almost nameless. It feels like a graveyard.
Yeah, the cities.
It feels like coffins. You can kind of get lost in there. Part of the idea is there's no beginning place, there's no ending place for this kind of hatred and atrocity. And I think at one point the architect said, it's not meant to be understood. It's like saying, I understand the Holocaust. You don't. It shouldn't. It can't be understood, really. And so trying to have everything encapsulated in one little understood piece, the architect said, no. It's meant to be confusing and disorienting. But what Susan Nyman said is a nation that erects a monument of shame for the evils of its history in its most prominent space is a nation that's not afraid to confront its own failures. There's strength in that, and humility in that, and the way they call it. Names are so important, what you name something. It's not just memorial to victims, it's memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. They're naming what happened to those people. They were murdered. They didn't just, they died in captivity in a camp. It's a victim of war. They were murdered. And they named that. Often we don't want to really name the bad things we do. We try to kind of gloss it up, gild it up a bit. But they name it, and they put it right there in the most prominent part of town. You have to pass by it. You don't have to go into it, but you have to see it. Seeing this, it makes me want to go to Montgomery, where the lynching monument is. I don't really want to go to Alabama for any other reasons, but I feel I should go for that. So many of you have read Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. He's the one that kind of was the brain behind this memorial, helped design. He did take some influence from this memorial in Berlin. But the names of the victims are carved into those columns that dangle from beams, like someone dangling from a noose from a tree. It evokes that visceral memory. I imagine weaving through those 801 steel columns, 801 counties where lynchings occurred, would be a similar experience to walking through this. There's no one way to feel about it. You're not supposed to walk out and say, here's how I feel now after going through that memorial. It's like going through the Holocaust Museum or going through a concentration camp. You feel odd taking pictures, but you want to remember. But you don't want to take a selfie in front of the gas chamber. People do. It's really interesting to talk more about concentration camps and visiting and why they have these educational programs for kids. And it used to be every student in Germany had to visit one. Now it's pretty much all due. But they don't try to make you have some feeling. They don't want to say, put yourself in the shoes of. They want to treat it more as an investigation. Can you figure out why they did this? Why this way? Why they might have done it in this manner? So it's more of an investigation to learn instead of have yourself a feeling now. You can fake feelings. So what do you like and dislike about this memorial from the little bit you can see? Or if you've ever been there before. Yeah.
I actually like the idea of no names, because then no one's forgotten. Because when you start putting names, there's people that get forgotten.
Yep.
And you can do that. The name of the memorial itself, I might have a slight problem with, only because there were more than the Jews that were killed in the Holocaust. Yeah. But in another way, I don't, because having relatives who came over here as immigrants, my parents are from Romania, and they were Saxons, which were at one point in the 1200s part of Germany or something. But they came over under the Jewish Federation. Like, if you look them up for their immigration status, they're no country, but they were helped by the Jewish League at the time, right after the war. So I guess in one way, the Jews kind of accepted everyone who was murdered as a Jew.
And this one kind of, is focused on Jews. Now, there are lots and lots of memorials around Germany for Holocaust victims of all kinds, and shapes, sizes, and ethnicities, and all throughout Germany. But the this was kind of focused on the Jews. You kind of see when you get to the higher stones here, just kind of the idea of kind of getting lost in it. Now this is one of our favorite memorials, and we kind of found this through that book by Susan Nyman. It's called The Block of Women. So this was like just a block from our hotel. It's a memorial, it's a little park. It commemorates the site of a protest rebellion by a large group of women in 1943. In February of 1943, the SS and Gestapo detained around 8,000 Jewish citizens in Berlin, including about 2,000 Jewish men who were partners in mixed marriages. The authorities separated these men from the rest of the prisoners and held them in the building that once held the Jewish Welfare Administration on Rosenstrasse street there. Once the women found out where their husbands were being held, they gathered together and they demanded to speak with their loved ones and requested their release. For a week, over 600 women protested daily in the street there. The women refused to leave until the Nazi authorities released the men of the families, even after threats from the SS. The Nazis knew that German morale would suffer if they murdered hundreds of unarmed women in the streets. Typically happens that way. So on March 5th, 1943, trucks laden with machine guns arrived at Rosenstrasse, but again the women would not back down. The following night, Joseph Goebbels ordered the release of all the men that were being held there. So the inscription of the memorial reads, "The power of civil disobedience and the power of love overcame the violence of the dictatorship. Women stood here, defying death. Give us our men back. Jewish men were free." So that's the inscription there on it. She says, Susan Nyman says, "What is tragic is not that these heroine names are unremembered, but that no one followed their example." She says, "What stopped others from doing so was not only the fear of Nazi terror, but something else as well. The belief that heroic action is futile and usually ends in death besides." That's why we need stories like this to remind us that sometimes heroic actions make a difference. The reality is, as much as sometimes we don't like to admit it, because sometimes we don't like the visuals of the reality, most major changes that have happened have happened and needed to happen because people took to the streets and refused to back down, and they marched or they sat there, not just in our country but around the world. Poland and Lech Walesa, what that's his name?
Yep.
You know, Arab Spring, all these things when people say, "Nope, we're not going to take it. You're going to have to murder us all, or you're going to have to change." And that's why people still try that today in this country, because it's worked. And sometimes we need those examples of how it works. And this is one of the really important things that I'm glad Germany has this memorial, because it's a memorial of hope, of something good. That even in the midst of this horrible situation, these 600 or so women said, "No, not going to take it. If we die, we die, but this is wrong." So Brian Stevenson suggests the U.S., especially southern buildings and streets should be renamed after people in these stories of hope and courage in the face of injustice. Like, there's tons of people who were in the South during Jim Crow who tried to do better, who helped people, who made a difference. And we don't know many of those people. And that's a shame. We know a lot of the perpetrators, and we should. But we should also know the stories of those who tried to make a difference and lift up those stories. Instead of having a street name for somebody who did a bunch of bad things, there's plenty of good people to name things after. Lift them up. It gives us hope as a nation that we too can do these things. And it's not just black Southerners do this. There's lots of white Southerners who made these remarkable things for their time that we forget. And we shouldn't. Lift them up. Memorialize them. Because we need stories of hope and heroic action to inspire us. The U.S. is filled with unknown heroes like this. It's not always easy to find them. There's a small plaque at Princeton remembering a guy named James Reeb. Anyone ever heard of James Reeb? So James Reeb was a student at Princeton. He was a Unitarian Universalist. pastor. He went down and marched in Selma and marched on behalf of civil rights, and he was beaten to death with clubs by police officers in Alabama. Minister, white minister, came down and said, I'm going to stand up for this. He was beaten and he was killed. His name deserves to be remembered. And it's at Princeton and some other places. Maybe you know some heroes like that. Lift them up. Celebrate them. It's important to remember the bad stuff. There's a whole museum in Berlin. It's really interesting. That is in the old SS headquarters that really just lays out, here's the SS, here's the leaders of it, here's what they did. We're going to name the perpetrators and really go through the horrible things they did. I think that's important to know the bad things. But it's also important to know the good things. And there are other memorials that highlight people who tried to do good things. There's a whole, anyone ever been to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem? Oh, people. There's a whole avenue of trees there named for different people that some we've heard of, like Schindler, and others we've never heard of, who risked their life to help save Jews. And their names are remembered in this kind of avenue of heroes. Again, it's balance. We need to know the perpetrators. We need to know why and how and what they did and not forget. We also need to know the heroes, the good things, the progress. So much is about balance. We tend to memorialize all that's wrong. And that's fine. We need to do that. We also need to do better at lifting up the stories of good. Any questions on that? How much time do I have left? Not much. Oh my goodness. We're almost done. This is a place called Sanssouci. So when you see it in German, it's all put together. Sanssouci. Here you see it as a comma. Sanssouci. It's French. Who knows what that means? Who remembers their high school French class? Without worry or care. So this was built by Frederick the Great. He was a really interesting dude. He was like the first, basically one of the first, like openly gay men to run a country and like have a military. I mean, kind of like shatters some illusions that people had about, gay men. Because you're not going to say anything about Frederick the Great, he would have you do. He led a really big army that took over a bunch of places. He also introduced potatoes to Europe. So you think like potato island? No, it was Frederick the Great that first really discovered. People used to plant potatoes for their flowers. He kind of learned from some you could eat them, and he made it widespread. He used his potatoes to feed his army, so they'd go and plant potatoes following their army, and he would have a steady supply. And that's what kind of brought potatoes as a main dish in Europe. So people go to his grave now, and they place potatoes in homage of Frederick the Great. But he did Sanssouci. He lived there without his wife, because he didn't care about his wife. It was no one's political marriages. So there's a lot of ideas of why it's called Without Care. He kind of would go there and just be himself without worry. But it's also kind of a thing for his life. And one of the things that we tend to assume is that the afterlife is good. We want there to be a heaven. We want there to be a God because we want eternal life. Well, Frederick didn't believe in the afterlife, didn't believe in God, and that kind of freed him. Because the reality is, if you are a military dictator, you're probably not going to be on the high list of good people. And so I think for him, maybe it's that worry. He's like, I'm not worried about afterlife. I'm not worried about God. I'm just going to live for now and do my thing. And I think, in reality, what kind of great world leaders would assume they wouldn't go to hell throughout history? I mean, you think about anybody who's led empires, you have to do some pretty horrible things. Right? I mean, even if you want to be a good moral person, you're going to have to do some pretty horrible things. I wouldn't want to be president. because I'd have to make some horrible things that would go against Christian faith. But as president, you kind of have to sometimes. These are tough decisions. And so he kind of put it off and said, I'm not even going to worry about that. And it's a perspective we don't think about very often. But that's kind of how he operated. It's probably easier not to believe in an afterlife if you're in that position. You can just fully commit to whatever your goal is in that position, whether it's taking over everybody or whatnot. So I know I wouldn't want to be president because what is good for the country would not always necessarily fit with my Christian ethic. I would want to have to make that vow that I do whatever's best for the country because my primary allegiance is to God, not to country. If it's a choice between my Christian ethic and following Jesus and what's good for the nation, I'm going to choose following Jesus every time. And there are other people who've done that throughout history. Conscientious objectors who say, I can't do this. Especially if it's a war they didn't believe in. Others said, you know what? As a Christian, this is a just cause. I'm going to sacrifice my life for my nation and for the world. Sometimes it fits both. Sometimes it doesn't. It's tough things, like, dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's a tough call. A lot more information. Like, I always grew up learning, we had to do that because otherwise we'd lose all these other Americans, the war would keep going on. That's always the narrative I've heard of why it was necessary. The more I've learned about it, the more that isn't necessarily true. But that's a nice narrative to say. For the story. All right, I got like 1 minute left. That's Frederick the Great on his horse. He loved his horse and his dogs. Didn't love his wife. At his grave, his favorite horse is buried with him. All his dogs, and his favorite dog is actually in the coffin with him. So, interesting fact about Frederick the Great. Did I buy a little Playmobil Frederick the Great for Gilby? Yes, I did. It's awesome. It's a little sword, a little horse, and a dog, of course. Okay, that's all. So, I could talk a lot more about Germany, the concentration camps, the museums, all of that. I think the key thing I came away with is this question of how do we remember? Because remembering is important. But how we remember is equally important. We can kind of tell ourselves stories and lies. Sometimes we can lie to ourselves so much it becomes the truth after a while, we actually start to believe it. You can read different histories of the U.S. or things, you can actually believe this is true. A lot of people saw Six over the last few days at the Hershey Theater. And, there's a lot of different histories of those different women. They kind of portrayed Anne Boleyn as kind of stupid. She really wasn't. She was actually pretty smart. But if you only watched that show, you'd have one idea of each of those women. But that's not all about those women. But it does a good job of saying we are more than just King Henry's story. We're people in our own right. Come and learn about us. Remember that podcast I was listening to about hunting and fishing in the New South? The historian was talking about this. The old model of history was to look at kings, generals, and presidents. And that's all you learn, right? You learn the main explorers, the main battles, the kings, but more and more now as a new school, is what were the normal, everyday people doing? What do they care about? What mattered to them? I think that's important for us to remember, that you can remember these big battles of World War II. People love to read a World War II book, let me tell you. But what about the Blumenthal's? What about everyday people and how that affected? Read from their perspectives. Remember the atrocities. Remember what happened. Don't pretend, this country doesn't have a racist history. It does. I'm sorry, it does. We pretend we're past that, but we're not. On the flip side, you can't say, well, that's all we are, and that's all African Americans ever be as victims. There has been a lot of progress, and they can and have done amazing things out of difficult situations. Let's not negate that as well. There's been conversations between Tim Scott and Obama on that. And they both kind of have a little bit right and a little bit wrong. You have to balance that. Say, yes, we've made progress. Yes, it's a land of great opportunity. Yes, though, there is this history behind it. And yes, that history does still affect the present. And if you can't have a plan of how do we continue to deal with that, you can't just say everything's good now. but you can't only focus on how it was all bad either. Because all of us are products of our history. How many of us had, grandparents who came over here to the U.S. and made it good, and that affects our education. It affects what we get. A lot of people had grandparents who were able to take advantage of the Veterans Act for free college, and it completely changed the course of their family history. History matters. There were some who weren't allowed that. That changes the course of their family history. We're all a product of our history and our choices. I always hear people say, well, your choices are all that matter. Everything is up to you. Well, that's stupid and wrong. It's not. If I can work really, really hard, I'm not going to play in the NBA. It's not going to happen. It's not up to my choice and my work ethic. It's just not. I could want to be a fighter pilot, but if I don't have the right eyesight, guess what? You don't get to. If you don't have access to good education and things, it's a lot harder. Some people overcome it, some people don't. But we're always a mixture of our circumstances, our histories, but also our choices and our work. And too often, we want to say it's all this or it's all this. Balance. The both and. Is really the way I've been kind of focusing in on how do I engage with history and our present context. One of the things Susan Nyman says really helpful is, you have all this stuff about MAGA and wokeness and all this. And, she wrote a book called Left is Not Woke. And kind of talk about how, the woke thing is actually not all liberal. And there are other books about how, this new brand of conservatism isn't really all that conservative. We go off the deep end on both ways. We love to run to extremes. But hopefully, as all these history things show us, we can come back to a sensible balance and moderation. And that's where we have to train ourselves. How are we reading? How are we watching? What are we thinking about? That we don't get tunnel vision into one extreme or the other. Because you'll always end up being wrong. Either way wrong right, way wrong left, or way wrong up, or way wrong down. You get all the balance together. So that's what I kind of came away with Germany. I'd love to talk more about it sometime. I'll mention it more in sermons and stuff. But if you like these kind of classes, let Jack know. I can do one after our Spain trip, or even do another one just on Germany sometime in the future, and some of the other concentration camps or things like that. I have to go do church.
So do we.
Yeah, you better be there. I know who's here.